In 1974, Cher filed for divorce from Sonny Bono and cited the legal ground as involuntary servitude. That is the phrase, those are the words she used. Not irreconcilable differences, not infidelity, not cruelty, involuntary servitude, the legal term for slavery. She was 30 years old. She was one of the most famous women in the world. She had a television show watched by 30 million people a week. She had a daughter. She had a wardrobe designed by Bob Mackie that had become iconic. And she was telling a court, under oath, that her marriage to the man who had made her famous had been, in the most precise legal language available, a form of bondage. When the divorce was finalized in 1975, and Cher asked for her share of the money they had earned together, the money from the hit records, the television show, the concerts, the endorsements, all of it, she got nothing. Not half, not a quarter, nothing. She said it plainly, decades later, on a podcast. The interviewer asked if she had walked away with half. She said, "I didn't walk with any of it, none of it." 13 years together, 6 years legally married, 40 million records sold. One of the most successful variety shows in television history. And the woman whose voice had made all of it possible walked out of the marriage with nothing because every dollar had been in his name, managed by him, controlled by him, spent by him, and when she left, there was almost nothing left to divide. That is the story behind the story of Sonny and Cher, not the matching outfits, not "I got you, babe," not the funny banter on the television show where she rolled her eyes at him and he played the fool. Behind all of that, for 13 years, was a man who had met a 16-year-old dropout in a Los Angeles coffee shop, taken complete control of her life, her money, her career, her identity, and her future, and built one of the biggest entertainment brands in the world out of a girl who did not know, until it was almost too late, that she was allowed to say no. And the strangest part of all of it, the part that makes this story unlike any other Hollywood divorce, is what happened after he died. On January 5, 1998, Sonny Bono hit a tree on a ski slope at the Heavenly Mountain Resort near Lake Tahoe. He was 62 years old. He was, by then, a Republican United States congressman. And the woman who had called their marriage slavery stood at his funeral, in front of his casket, and gave one of the most devastating eulogies anyone in that room had ever heard. She wept. She told the mourners that Sonny was the most unforgettable character she had ever known. She said she had loved him. And then she said the line that has followed her ever since. She said, without him, she would not be where she was, wherever that was. This is the story of the marriage that made Sonny and Cher famous, the control that ran underneath it for 13 years, the divorce that used the word slavery, the death that came 23 years later on a mountain in California, and the woman who stood at his funeral and wept for the man she had once called her master. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Salvatore Philip Bono was born in Detroit on February 16, 1935, the son of Italian immigrants from Sicily, and he grew up with exactly one obsession: music. His family moved to Inglewood, California, near Los Angeles, when he was a child, and by his teens he was writing songs and trying to get anyone in the music business to listen to them. He had no formal musical training. He could not read music. He played a little ukulele and a little piano, and he had a voice that was, in the kindest possible description, limited. What he had instead was a hustler's instinct for the business side of the industry, an ear for what would sell, and a willingness to do any job that got him inside the building. In the late 1950s, he talked his way into Specialty Records, the label that had Little Richard and Sam Cooke, working as a gopher and sometimes songwriter. When that label closed, he moved to Gold Star Studios in Hollywood, where he attached himself to the most important man in the room, Phil Spector. Spector was, in the early 1960s, the most revolutionary record producer in America. He had invented the wall of sound, the technique of layering dozens of instruments and voices into a single, overwhelming, echoey wave of noise that turned pop singles into something that sounded like they were being played inside a cathedral. He produced the Ronettes, the Crystals, the Righteous Brothers. He was a genius, and he was also, as the world would learn decades later, a dangerous and violent man. But in 1962 he was king, and Sonny Bono was his eager, devoted assistant, doing whatever Spector needed, playing percussion on sessions, fetching coffee, learning everything he could about how the machine worked. It was while working for Spector, in November of 1962, that Sonny Bono walked into a Los Angeles coffee shop and met a 16-year-old girl named Sherilyn Sarkeesian. She was a high school dropout from Fresno. Her mother, Georgia Holt, was a model and occasional actress who had been married multiple times and moved the family constantly. Cher's childhood had been chaotic and unstable in the specific way that the children of beautiful, restless, broke women experience instability. She had Armenian heritage on her father's side, a father who was largely absent, and a mother who loved her but could not provide consistency. She had come to Los Angeles because she wanted to be famous, though she had no particular plan for how to get there and no connections to anyone who could help. Sonny was 27, Cher was 16. That age gap, 11 years, would define the power dynamic of everything that followed. They did not, by either of their later accounts, fall in love at first sight. Their relationship began as something more like a mentorship, which is a polite word for what happens when a 27-year-old man with connections takes a 16-year-old girl with none under his wing. Sonny let her move into his apartment. He told her, early on, that it was platonic, that she could have her own room, that he would look after her. And at first that seems to have been true. He was protective. He was kind. He saw, before anyone else did, that her voice, which was deep and unusual, and unlike anything on the radio, was extraordinary. He started bringing her to Spector's sessions. She sang backup. Her voice ended up on some of the most famous records of the early 1960s. She was there, singing in the background, on Be My Baby by the Ronettes. She was there on You've Lost That Lovin' Feelin' by the Righteous Brothers. She was 16, 17, 18 years old, singing on records that would eventually be considered among the greatest pop singles ever made, and almost nobody knew she was in the room. The relationship became romantic. The exact timeline has been described differently by both of them at different points, but by 1964, they were a couple. They had an unofficial wedding ceremony in Tijuana, Mexico that year, which was not legally binding. They would not legally marry until 1969, after the birth of their daughter Chastity, later known as Chaz. And from the very start, the structure of the relationship was clear. Sonny made the decisions. Sonny chose the songs. Sonny handled the money. Sonny decided where they lived, what they wore, where they performed, and how the act would be presented. Cher sang. She was, in the dynamic they built together, the extraordinary talent, and he was the brain, the manager, the producer, the husband, the father figure, and the boss, all at once. He was also, and this is the part that gets complicated, genuinely talented at the business side. He knew how to write a hook. He knew how to position an act. He knew what the market wanted. And in 1965, he wrote a song for the two of them that captured, in 3 minutes, everything the public would believe about their relationship for the next decade. It was called I Got You, Babe. It went to #1. And it turned Sonny and Cher, overnight, into the most famous couple in American music. Cher said later that the song was about their actual life, that they had been broke, that nobody believed in them, that the lyrics were real, and they were real, in the moment they were written. Two people who had nothing except each other, singing about it. What nobody listening to that song in 1965 could have known was that the man singing I Got You, Babe, to a girl he had met when she was 16, was also, simultaneously, building a structure around her that she would not fully understand for another decade, and that when she finally did understand it, she would use a word for it that nobody had ever used in a Hollywood divorce filing before. I Got You, Babe went to #1 in August of 1965, and within weeks, Sonny and Cher were everywhere. They were on every television show that would have them. They were in magazines, they were on tour, and they were, almost immediately, famous for something beyond the music, which was the way they looked. The matching fur vests, the bell-bottoms, the long hair on both of them, the paisley and fringe and boots. They were the first pop act to turn the counterculture look into mainstream entertainment, hippie enough to seem cool to young people and harmless enough to seem safe to their parents. They were, in marketing terms, the perfect bridge act, and Sonny understood that from the beginning. He dressed them, he chose the outfits, he staged the image. He was not just the songwriter and the manager, he was the art director of their entire public existence. The hits kept coming through the mid-60s. The Beat Goes On in 1967, Baby Don't Go, Bang Bang, My Baby Shot Me Down, which Cher recorded solo, and which became one of her signature songs. Sonny wrote most of them, he produced most of them, he managed everything. And the money, all of it, went through him. This is the part of the story that looks different depending on when you tell it. In 1965 and 1966, Sonny Bono's total control over the act and the finances looked like competence. He was the man who had made it all happen. He had taken a shy 16-year-old with no connections and turned her into one of the most famous women in the world. He had written the songs, built the brand, negotiated the deals. Without him, there would have been no Cher. That was the narrative, and it was partly true. What it left out was that without Cher, there would have been no Sonny either. His voice was thin. His stage presence on its own was modest. The entire act worked because her voice was extraordinary, and his songwriting framed it, and neither half functioned without the other. But the money, the contracts, the business decisions, all flowed through one person, and that person was Sonny, and Cher had signed whatever he told her to sign, because she had been 16 when this started, and she had trusted him completely. By the late 1960s, the hits dried up. Musical tastes shifted. The summer of love came and went, and Sonny and Cher's soft, accessible version of counterculture suddenly seemed dated alongside Hendrix and the Rolling Stones, and everything that had gotten harder and louder around them. Their records stopped selling. Their concert bookings shrank. They were, for a stretch of the late 60s, genuinely struggling, playing smaller and smaller nightclub venues and wondering if the whole thing was over. Sonny pivoted. He put together a nightclub act that leaned into comedy, building the dynamic that would eventually make them television stars. The format was simple and effective. Cher was the tall, gorgeous, sharp-tongued wife who cut her husband down with one-liners. Sonny was the short, earnest, slightly ridiculous husband who absorbed the jokes and kept coming back for more. The audience loved it because it felt real, because it was, in a surface sense, real. She did think he was ridiculous sometimes. He did keep coming back. The comedy was built on a genuine dynamic between two people who had been together for years and knew each other's rhythms. In 1971, CBS gave them a television variety show called The Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour. It was an immediate hit. By its second season, it was drawing 30 million viewers a week, one of the most watched programs on American television. Cher appeared in the Bob Mackie gowns that became iconic, elaborate, sequined, barely there costumes that turned her into a fashion symbol overnight. The show was funny, warm, and enormously popular, and it ran for 3 seasons. And behind every episode, behind every sequined gown, behind every eye roll and put-down, the same structure held. Sonny ran everything. Sonny managed the money. Sonny made the deals. Sonny decided what Cher wore, what she sang, what she said. She was, by her own later description, an employee in her own marriage, performing on a stage her husband had built, wearing clothes her husband had approved, earning money her husband controlled. She was the biggest female entertainer in America, and she did not have access to her own bank account. The cage was made of gold and sequins, and 30 million people watched it every week and thought it was a love story. The reality behind the Comedy Hour set was nothing like the show. What 30 million viewers saw every week was a happily married couple trading jokes, the beautiful wife gently mocking the lovable husband, two people who were so comfortable with each other that the whole country felt invited into their living room. What was actually happening in that living room was something Cher would not fully describe for decades, and when she did, the details were worse than the public had imagined. Sonny controlled the money completely. Cher has said, repeatedly and in multiple venues over the years, that she had no access to her own earnings. The television show, the records, the concerts, the merchandising, all of it went through Sonny, through companies he had set up, into accounts he managed. She was the face and the voice of one of the biggest entertainment brands in America, and she could not write a check. She was, by every financial measure, an employee of her own husband, working without a salary, receiving an allowance rather than a share. He also controlled her socially. She has described being isolated from friends, from outside advice, from anyone who might have told her that the arrangement she was living in was not normal. He decided who came to the house. He decided what she wore off camera as well as on it. In one episode she described on the Dax Shepard podcast in 2026, she said Sonny burned her clothes in the yard during a jealous rage, destroyed the things she had chosen for herself because he had not approved of them. That image, a man standing in his own yard burning his wife's clothes, is not the image of a comedy partner trading harmless jokes on a variety show. It is the image of a man exerting dominance over a woman's most basic personal choices. And then, by the early 1970s, the marriage ceased to function as a marriage in any private sense at all, even as it continued to function perfectly as a television show. Both of them took other partners. What makes this particular arrangement strange, even by the loose standards of 1970s Hollywood, is that they did it under the same roof. Sonny began a relationship with a woman named Connie Foreman, who moved into the household. In a diary entry from August of 1973 that was later made public, Sonny wrote plainly that he and Connie lived together as husband and wife, in the same house where his actual wife and their daughter also lived. Cher, for her part, had also begun seeing other people. The marriage had become, in the most literal sense, an arrangement. Two people who no longer loved each other, romantically staying under the same roof, because the television show required them to be Sonny and Cher, and being Sonny and Cher required being married. Cher has said she did not fully understand what was happening to her until someone from outside the bubble told her. That someone was David Geffen. Geffen was, by the early 1970s, one of the most powerful men in the music industry, the founder of Asylum Records, a man who had managed Joni Mitchell and the Eagles and understood, better than almost anyone in the business, how the industry exploited talent. He met Cher, saw the situation she was in, and told her plainly that she needed to get out. She went to Sonny. She told him what Geffen had said, and she offered him a compromise, the kind of compromise that tells you how deeply the control had been internalized. She said she would stay with him, she would keep the act going, she would keep being Sonny and Cher, if he would make her a partner. An equal, 50-50, her name next to his on the contracts. He said no. That was the moment. Not a dramatic blow-up, not a screaming fight on a television set. A quiet conversation in which a woman asked the man who controlled her entire life to share that control equally, and the man said no, because sharing control was not something he was willing to do. Cher filed for divorce in 1974. She cited involuntary servitude. The Comedy Hour was cancelled the same year. The show that had been built on the fiction of a happy marriage could not survive the public knowledge that the marriage was over. CBS pulled it. The thing that had made them both famous, the thing that had drawn 30 million viewers, ended because the lie underneath it had become unsustainable. The divorce proceedings were ugly. Sonny fought for custody of chastity. There were battles over money, and when Cher's lawyers finally got a full accounting of the finances, what they found was devastating. The money was largely gone, spent, reinvested, lost in ventures Sonny had managed. The fortune that two people had built over 13 years of hit records and a top-rated television show had been run through one man's hands and come out the other side as almost nothing. Cher walked away with none of it. She was 30 years old. She had been with Sonny Bono since she was 16. She had never, in her adult life, made a decision about her own career or her own money without his approval. She did not know how to manage herself because she had never been allowed to learn, and now she was alone, broke, famous, and free for the first time in her life. She had no idea what to do with the freedom. She was about to find out. The years right after the divorce were the proof that Sonny Bono had been wrong about one thing and right about another. He had been wrong that Cher needed him. She did not. Within a few days of the divorce being finalized in June of 1975, she married Greg Allman of the Allman Brothers Band, a relationship that was chaotic and short-lived and ended in divorce within 3 years. She had a son, Elijah Blue, from that marriage. The personal life remained turbulent, but the career, the thing Sonny had always controlled and always taken credit for, exploded without him. She launched a solo variety show. She went to Broadway. She went to Hollywood, not as a singer but as an actress, and she turned out to be extraordinary at it. She starred in Silkwood in 1983, opposite Meryl Streep, and earned a Golden Globe. She starred in Mask in 1985 and won Best Actress at Cannes. She starred in Moonstruck in 1987 and won the Academy Award. Cher, the girl Sonny Bono had found in a coffee shop at 16 and controlled for 13 years, had become one of the most acclaimed actresses of her generation without him. And then, in 1998, she released Believe, a dance record that used a vocal effect called auto-tune in a way nobody had heard before, and it went to #1 worldwide. She was 52 years old. She had been famous for over 30 years, and she was having the biggest hit of her entire career, without Sonny, without a husband, without a manager who controlled her money, entirely on her own. Sonny's path was different in every way. After the divorce, his entertainment career collapsed. He tried a solo variety show. It failed. He tried solo music. It went nowhere. The public had loved Sonny as half of Sonny and Cher. They did not love Sonny alone, because alone, without that voice beside him, the charm did not carry. He was a short, earnest, moderately talented man who had been made enormous by proximity to a genuine star, and without her he was, by the industry's cold measurement, ordinary. He reinvented himself completely. He moved to Palm Springs and entered politics, running for mayor in 1988 on a platform of local business issues and winning. He served as mayor for 4 years, then won election to the United States House of Representatives in 1994 as a Republican. He was re-elected in 1996. Congressman Sonny Bono, the man who had once stood on stage in a fur vest singing "I Got You, Babe," was now voting on federal legislation and serving on congressional committees. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary second act, and it happened entirely because the first act had ended, because Cher had walked away, and because the machine that had been Sonny and Cher only worked when both of them were in it. They had, by the mid-1990s, settled into something almost unrecognizable from the bitterness of the divorce. Time had done what time does. The anger had cooled. And one day, years after the split, Sonny walked into Cher's kitchen and said something she had not expected. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. He said he was sorry. That was it. No press conference, no public statement, no memoir chapter. Just Sonny Bono walking into Cher's kitchen one day, years after the divorce, and saying, in plain language, that he had realized he had hurt her in so many ways, and that he had been wrong. Cher said later that those words went a long way for her. Not all the way. The damage of 13 years does not disappear because a man says sorry in a kitchen, but a long way. Far enough that the anger she had carried since the involuntary servitude filing began, slowly, to loosen. far enough that when they saw each other after that, at events for their daughter, at industry functions, the temperature between them was different. They were not friends exactly. They were something harder to name, two people bound together by a shared history so enormous that neither of them could fully explain it to anyone who had not been inside it. They reunited professionally once, briefly, in a moment that became one of the most watched television appearances of the 1980s. In 1987, Sonny appeared on Cher's television special, and the two of them sang "I Got You, Babe" together one more time. The audience lost their minds. It had been over a decade since they had performed together. They were both older, both changed, both carrying the weight of everything that had happened between them. And for 3 minutes, standing side by side, singing the song he had written for her when they were broke and in love and nobody else believed in them, something of what they had been flickered back to life. It was not a reconciliation, it was a memory, but it was real, and both of them knew it. Through the 1990s, they stayed loosely connected. Sonny was in Washington. Cher was conquering Hollywood. Their daughter Chastity, who would later transition and become Chaz Bono, was growing up. The custody battles of the 70s had long since faded. They had arrived, after 20 years of distance, at something that resembled peace. Then, on January 5, 1998, Sonny Bono went skiing at the Heavenly Mountain Resort near South Lake Tahoe, on the California-Nevada border. He was 62 years old. He was serving his second term in Congress. He was married to his fourth wife, Mary Whitaker, and he was, by every account of the people around him, in good spirits. At some point during the afternoon, he lost control on a slope and struck a tree. The impact killed him. He was found by ski patrol. He had died of blunt force trauma. He was 62. Cher was told by phone. She later said the news hit her in a way she had not expected, because she had assumed, in the way people assume about the permanent fixtures of their lives, that Sonny would simply always be there. He had been the first important person in her adult life. He had been there since she was 16. He had controlled her, hurt her, made her, limited her, apologized to her, and stayed connected to her for 36 years. And now he was gone, killed by a tree on a ski slope, suddenly and permanently. She went to the funeral. She stood at the front. And she gave a eulogy that people who were there still talk about. Because it was not the eulogy of an ex-wife performing grief. It was the eulogy of a woman telling the truth about a man she could not reduce to one thing. She stood at the front of the church and spoke without notes. Cher had written 100 pages of preparation for the eulogy. She tore them all up before the service. When she stood in front of the mourners, the congressman, the family, the cameras, she spoke from memory and from something deeper than memory. She said Sonny was the most unforgettable character she had ever met. She said he had been funny and kind and impossible. She said that when she had first met him, she had thought he was the most unusual person she had ever seen, with his beautiful suit and his long fingers and his Cuban heel boots. She was describing a man she had met when she was 16 years old, a man who had been the most important and most damaging person in her entire life, and she was doing it with a tenderness that stunned the people watching. She said that without him, she would not be where she was, wherever that was. That last phrase, wherever that was, is the one that has stayed, because it contained the whole contradiction. She was Cher. She was one of the most famous women alive. She had won an Oscar. She had sold over 100 million records. She was an icon in every sense the word has. And she was standing at the funeral of the man who had made all of that possible, and who had also, for 13 years, kept her in a cage while it happened. Wherever that was. She could not quite name the place she had ended up, because the path that had brought her there was too tangled with the man in the casket. She wept openly. The cameras captured it, and the country, watching the footage that night on the evening news, saw something it had not expected. Not an ex-wife going through the motions, not a celebrity performing grief. A woman who had called her marriage slavery, standing over the man who had enslaved her, and mourning him with her whole body. She said later that she had a bond with Sonny she could not break. She said if he walked into the room right now, she still could not break it. She could not explain it. She did not try. It was their relationship, and it worked for them, she said. She did not expect anyone to understand it, because it was weird. That word, weird, is maybe the most honest word in the entire Sonny and Cher story. Not tragic, not scandalous, not romantic. Weird. A relationship that contained control and genuine affection, exploitation and real creative partnership, involuntary servitude, and a love song that meant what it said when it was written. All of it true at the same time. All of it weird. Sonny Bono was buried at Desert Memorial Park in Cathedral City, California. He was 62. Mary Bono, his fourth wife, won the special election to take his congressional seat and held it for 14 years. And Cher went home and kept working and kept being Cher, which was the thing Sonny had built and the thing she had freed from him and the thing that had, in the end, outlasted both of them. The story did not end with Sonny's funeral. The money followed him out of the grave. In the years after his death, the 50-50 split of Sonny and Cher's music royalties, the one thing Cher had secured in the 1978 divorce settlement, continued as agreed. Mary Bono, Sonny's widow, administered his estate, and Cher received her half. For over 2 decades it worked. The royalties from I Got You Babe and The Beat Goes On and the rest of the catalogue flowed to both sides, quietly, without conflict. Then, in 2016, Mary Bono's legal team began using a provision of the Copyright Act to argue that Sonny's estate could terminate Cher's share of the royalties. By 2021, the payments had stopped entirely. Cher, who had walked out of a 13-year marriage with nothing, who had been told her finances were in ruins because her husband had spent everything, who had rebuilt her entire career and life from zero at 30 years old, was now, at 75, being told that even the one financial right she had fought for in the divorce was being taken away. She sued. The case went to federal court, and in 2024, a judge ruled in Cher's favor, confirming that the divorce agreement could not be overridden by copyright law and that she was owed every dollar that had been withheld. Over $400,000 in back royalties was due to her. Sonny Bono had been dead for 26 years, and the fight over the money he had controlled during the marriage was still going on. That is the thread that runs through the entire story, from the coffee shop in 1962 to the federal courthouse in 2024. Control. Who had it? Who lost it? Who tried to take it back? The 16-year-old girl who signed whatever her 27-year-old boyfriend told her to sign. The woman who called her own marriage involuntary servitude. The ex-wife who walked away with nothing and became one of the most successful entertainers in the history of American music. And the widow of the man who had started it all, trying, a quarter century after his death, to take away the last piece Cher had managed to keep. Look at the whole shape of it. A hustler from Detroit who could not really sing, working as Phil Spector's assistant, walking into a coffee shop and finding a 16-year-old dropout with the most extraordinary voice he had ever heard. 13 years building something together that neither of them could have built alone. 40 million records, a television show watched by 30 million people, a brand so powerful that it survived their divorce and his death and her reinvention and the passage of half a century. And underneath all of it, from the first day to the last, one person holding all the power and the other person singing. She called it involuntary servitude. He called it partnership. The truth, as she said herself, was weird. It was both. It was a cage and a launching pad. It was exploitation and genuine creative collaboration. It was a man who saw her talent before anyone else did, and then spent 13 years making sure she could never use it without him. She used it without him anyway. She won an Oscar. She sold 100 million records. She reinvented herself across 5 decades, from 60s folk to 70s variety television to 80s film to 90s dance pop and beyond. She became, by any measure, one of the most durable and successful entertainers in the history of the industry. And she did all of it after walking away from the man who had told her she could not do it alone. And still, decades after the divorce, decades after the apology in the kitchen, decades after the funeral where she wept and said she could not break the bond, she said the same thing. Without him, she would not be where she was, wherever that was. She never stopped saying it. She could not, because it was true, and the fact that it was true was the thing that made the story impossible to reduce to a simple telling. He had found her. He had made her. He had controlled her. He had hurt her. He had apologized. He had died, and she had stood at his casket and wept for the man she had called her master, because he had also been the man who, before anyone else in the world, had heard her voice and believed it was worth something. That was the marriage that made them famous. And it was the marriage that ended them, because the fame it created could not survive the truth of how it had been built. Sonny needed Cher to be great. Cher needed Sonny to begin. And neither of them, for the rest of their lives, could figure out how to be grateful for that without also being destroyed by it. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.